Good evening, comrades. Welcome to tonight's Labour Left Alliance session on Zionism. The speaker is Tony Greenstein. Tony this evening is going to talk about Zionism and anti-Semitism, and that's obviously going to cover a very important and a key period in the history of Zionism, and indeed one of the areas that's proved controversial and politically useful, I think, to certain Zionists in their attacks on the left in the Labour Party. But I'm not going to impinge anymore on Tony's talk this evening. Just to remind comrades, the usual pattern is that Tony will talk for around about 35 to 45 minutes or so, and that will be then followed by questions and contributions from the floor. Can I ask you, please, if you want to speak or ask a question, to use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of your panels there. You should be able to see it. If you've got a problem with that, you can also use the question and answer box, and I and Tony and others will be monitoring that so that any questions that you have can be put directly. Can I ask that you don't use the chat box for questions? Obviously, you might want to say something, and dialogue during the course of the talk is always useful, but it is very difficult for me, for Tony, and for the comrades who are doing the technical side of this to actually pick up on that. And it would be better partly to give it the appearance of a meeting, a physical meeting, but also because it's always good for comrades to get to know each other. It's probably better for you to actually come in and talk and make your points that way. Okay, so we'll kick off now, and Tony's going to begin the talk, and then we'll move into the questions and discussion. So thanks, Tony.
Right, thank you, comrades. Can I ask of you, Kevin, that you let me know at the half-hour stage where I am, because one talent I don't have is measuring the quantity of my output in terms of time.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And welcome to everyone. There are 68 people here at the moment. I don't know whether we'll beat the 100 that we had for my first talk, or maybe I've put off 1/3 of my audience already, which therefore doesn't look particularly promising. Okay, thank you. If you recall what I said last time, that Zionism is not a movement that has existed as the Zionists would have it, because every nationalist movement creates its own mythology. It hasn't existed since time immemorial, since the time of the so-called expulsion of the Jews from Palestine at the time of the Romans. Zionism was very much a product of the modern colonial era, or the late colonial era to be precise. It was as late as possible in many ways. It was only formed organizationally at the very end of the 19th century. But we should just understand the uniqueness of Zionism. Zionism is a settler colonial movement. It's one of a number which have existed throughout the world at different times. The last major settler colonial state was that in South Africa, which demised about 20 years ago. And Israel really is the only active settler colonial state in existence. But there were some unique features about it. Firstly, Zionism never sought to exploit the indigenous population. It wasn't, for example, like the South African mode, which depended on the super exploitation of black labor in the diamond mines and the gold mines. Zionism sought, although it was not explicit about this, it was certainly implicit in it, it sought the exclusion or the transfer of the Palestinian population, although of course they didn't use the term Palestine at that time. in the words of Herzl, they wanted to spirit them across the borders. This was always because they wanted to create as pure an ethnic state as was possible. The second thing about Zionism, which makes it really quite unique, is it didn't have as such a mother country. If you think again of South Africa, the South African settlers were sponsored firstly by the Netherlands, and then about the beginning of the 19th century, the end of the 18th century, Britain supplanted the Netherlands. So it became the mother country, and lots of British settlers then began arriving. And in fact, you had really two different settler communities, the British, the English on the one hand, and the Dutch, the Afrikaans on another. And we know, in fact, there were two wars between British imperialism and the Afrikaners, the Afrikaner Wars, the Boer Wars. So Israel is fairly unique in that. And what we had was the Zionist movement was set up following the 1897 Zionist Congress, the first Zionist Congress, and it set about creating the infrastructure of a state to be. And this was quite unique. It was a political movement that was creating a state in order to put it somewhere when the time was ripe. So all sorts of Zionist organizations were created, such as the Jewish National Fund, whose purpose, a very important organization, was in its terms to redeem the land of Palestine, or Eretz Yisrael, as they say, the land of Israel. And what they mean by redeem is alienate the land forever from the indigenous population. Once it bought up land, once it came into possession of land, which it did through purchases mainly from absent Arab landlords, that land would never ever return to the use of the Palestinians. And that pertains to this very day. The land the Jewish National Fund controls, and it controls 93% of the land of Israel with the Israeli Land Authority, is for the use of the Jewish population of Israel, not the Palestinians. In fact, the history of Israel is the successive confiscation of Arab land, and that erupted in 1976 in Land Day when 6 Israeli Palestinians were killed. Now, the topic of today's talk is Zionism and anti-Semitism. And of course, if you were gullible, and I'm sure none of those of you who are here are gullible, but if you were gullible, you might think, as a result of the Labour Party allegations of anti-Semitism and the whole campaign that has occurred, that Zionism has been concerned about anti-Semitism, that this is one of its main obsessions, fighting anti-Semitism wherever it occurs. And we have, for example, a campaign against anti-Semitism, a very right-wing Zionist organization, but that's its name, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. We have the Community Security Trust, which is dedicated to defending the Jewish community, again, against anti-Semitism. And it produces an annual report for every year. It's done so for about the last 10, 15 years on anti-Semitism. So you would imagine that Zionism was a movement which was overly concerned with anti-Semitism, however it defines it. And that's, of course, the point. So the first thing I have to say is Zionism was indeed a reaction to anti-Semitism. Of that, there is no doubt. It wasn't because of the 2,000-year longing of Jews to go back to Palestine, although most of them, of course, had never been there. Zionism was a reaction to the specific circumstances that pertained in the Tsarist Empire, in the Pale of Settlement. For those of you who know, 90-odd% of Russian Jews were confined within an area called the Pale of Settlement. Parts of Poland, parts of Latvia, Lithuania, and Russia itself. And in 1871, and again in 1881, with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, a whole series of pogroms broke out centered on Odessa, on the Black Sea. And Zionism was a reaction to that. But Zionism was a particular reaction. Most Jews reacted by looking to their own self-defense, to unity with others in the fight against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism and these pogroms were deliberately stirred up by the Tsarist regime as a means of diverting the wrath of the Russian people. The Black Hundreds was the main organization, which was directly sponsored by the Tsarist regime, von Plehve, with whom Herzl had gone to visit only 3-4 months after the massacre at Kishinev. So Zionism was a reaction to anti-Semitism, but it was a reaction of a different kind because it accepted the main parameters of what the anti-Semites were saying. Zionism did not believe you could fight anti-Semitism. It believed that anti-Semitism was inherent in the non-Jew. It accepted that Jews were strangers in other people's lands. And it accepted, in many cases, the rightfulness of anti-Semitism. It understood that if it were in the same position, it would do the same to people who were there who did not belong. And as we see today in Israel, that is precisely the case. There's been a continuous attempt to deport and expel the 40,000 Black refugees in Israel who came mainly from the Sudan and Eritrea. Why? Because they're not Jewish, and even worse, they are Black. 2 crimes that they've committed, and that for most Israelis is more than enough to seek their expulsion. But they haven't yet been expelled, despite many, many attempts. It is, of course, neither here nor there. And I quoted, and I'll quote again, the saying of Leo Pinsker, who was a founder in 1881, 1882, i.e. directly after the Odessa pogroms, of the Lovers of Zion, the first proto-Zionist organization, which began the initial colonization of Israel. They were called the Biluim. Let us go up to the house of Jacob. It's a passage in the Bible. So, and they were the part of the first Aliyah. Aliyah is a wave of emigration, and there were 5 such Aliyah. And the first Aliyah existed from 1882 up to 1904. It wasn't particularly a Zionist Aliyah in the sense that they went as colonists and they ended up, in essence, running plantations, which did exploit the indigenous labor. And as we will see if we ever have time, there was a reaction against that by labor Zionism under Ben-Gurion and the beginning of the labor Zionist Aliyah, which was the second Aliyah from 1904 to 1914. But Pinsker said, and he was a doctor, so he called anti-Semitism Judeophobia. People still do, incidentally. He said Judeophobia is then a mental disease. And as a mental disease, it is hereditary. And having been inherited for 2,000 years, it is incurable. And of course, if a disease is incurable, if you're going to treat it, you treat it as a palliative to make it the patient as comfortable as possible. But what you don't do is fight the disease because you know you can't fight it. There is no point in fighting it. And that was the attitude of Zionism towards anti-Semitism. You couldn't fight it because it was ingrained. It was part of the DNA of being non-Jewish in Europe, because that's, of course, where it was happening. So that was the attitude of Zionism. And Zionism came, since Zionism was a project to establish the separate Jewish ethno-nationalist state, it came to see anti-Semitism as its ally, because what it wanted above all was a state that would perpetuate the Jewish people and make the Jewish people like every other people. It was in the sense, although Zionism hated assimilation of the Jewish people to the non-Jewish people, this was a massive threat. And so Zionism ended up despising and hating emancipation because it opened the possibilities that Jews would assimilate. And in places like Germany, before Hitler took power, I mean, the marrying out rate of the Jewish community was about 50%, which it is in Britain and America today. So Zionism has not found a solution to it. But Zionism saw in anti-Semitism a means by which the Jews would be kept together. And Herzl, Theodor Herzl, who in 1897 founded the Zionist organization, the World Zionist Organization, and held the first Zionist conference. It was quite clear. Theodor Herzl was a Viennese journalist working for the New Free Press, owned by a couple of Jewish people, but it was not Zionist, and he was under strict instructions not to include his Zionist beliefs in the reports that he filed. Herzl was in Paris, in France, at the time of the Dreyfus affair from 1794 onwards. You'll remember this convulsed France. In a sense, it was symbolic of the struggle of Republicans against the reactionaries, against the monarchists, the clericalists, the militarists. All this struggle was symbolized in the figure of Captain Dreyfus, even though he himself was maybe not the ideal figure in so many ways. He was no revolutionary. And Herzl said, when this whole movement grew up, Émile Zola writing J'accuse and then having to flee France, demonstrations and a fight to get the army to retract and so on. French intellectuals took sides against the anti-Dreyfusards. People like Edouard Drumont, the editor of La Libre Parole, he was the leader of it. He was a deputy to the French Assembly from Algiers. So he had some considerable support, and his paper sold 100,000 copies, and his book, The Eternal Jew, again sold out many editions. He was a virulent anti-Semite, but to Herzl, he was an artist, he described him in his diaries. And Herzl said, he described his feelings in his diary. I think page 6 of the diary. He said, "In Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism." And in that single sentence, Herzl summed up the Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism. He understood it historically, he pardoned it, and above all, he recognized the emptiness and futility of trying to, in inverted commas, combat anti-Semitism. And this was the Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism. So anyone who believes that Zionism was a movement that fought anti-Semitism was wrong. On the contrary, the Zionists saw something good in the anti-Semites, and it wasn't unique. It happens with every people, with every group, that when you have pogroms, when you have attacks, etc., a section of that people will draw the conclusion that such a fight is not possible, and they need to repatriate, to escape, to flee, and they draw up the idea that they themselves are in the wrong, that it's because of their particular situation that the racism has arisen. Another example of that would be McGarveyism in America in the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, which has often been called black fascism or black Zionism, incidentally. McGarvey drew the conclusion similarly that the problem with the Africans, the Afro-Americans, was that they weren't in Africa. And he began the Back to Africa movement. And he likewise saw something good in the Ku Klux Klan, with whom he had quite friendly relations. And he said of them at one point, there's a very good book by Paul Gilroy on black fascism. He said that the KKK were lynching racial pride into the black people. So, I mean, he came under massive criticism for that, but it's worth understanding. In this sense, Zionism is not unique. It's a separatist reaction to racism, usually amongst the petty bourgeoisie, who understand very well that if they enter into such a fight, they will be joining hands with those that they despise, the proletariat. And Herzl issued, it was in 1895, this pamphlet. I don't know whether you can see it. It's upside down, isn't it? But if you can read upside down, then you will see it. The Jewish state, the Judenstaat. It's literally the state of the Jews. And the subtitle is An Attempt at a Modern Solution of the Jewish Question, because that was how it was posed. And it's an incredibly interesting book, because it really sums up everything about the Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism. And so I'm going to quote from a few passages in this book. Let me just, okay, on page 24 of the book, it said, or Herzl said, page 25, in the principal countries where anti-Semitism prevails, it does so as a result of the emancipation of the Jews. In other words, Herzl took the same attitude as so many other Zionists, that the problems of Jews, the anti-Semitism that had arisen solely because, in essence, the Jews were no longer in their place in the ghettos. They had been freed from the ghettos, and this was the beginning of the problems that they endured. On the next page, he says, anti-Semitism, he said, its immediate cause, and this shows that the Zionist attitude to the diaspora, to the Jews outside Palestine, which of course was virtually every Jew at that point in time, was one of contempt. Zionism hated what it called the accursed galut. Galut is the Hebrew name for diaspora. And it said, anti-Semitism, its immediate cause is our excessive production of mediocre intellects who cannot find an outlet downwards or upwards. That is to say, no wholesome outlet in either direction. And this is the passage which is, I think, interesting, because if you didn't know it was from Herzl, you would think it was from an anti-Semite. When we sink, we become a revolutionary proletariat, the subordinate officers of all revolutionary parties. And at the same time, when we rise, quote, there rises also our terrible power of the purse. In other words, Herzl completely accepted the idea that Jews dominated financial commercial transactions, that Jews were primarily interested in business, and it was inherent in their role. On the next page, but one, page 28, Herzl was quite clear. He'd drawn the conclusion that, and I quote, the governments of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism will be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want. And that was really the beginning of an alliance with the anti-Semites. Herzl recognized that without anti-Semitism, there would be no Zionism. And once your main goal is the achievement of a Jewish state, then actually the anti-Semites are your friends because they were helping you to fulfill it. One of the real problems that Zionism faced, I mean, from the very start, is that so many Jews were not interested. Indeed, not only were they not interested, they were actively hostile to the Zionist movement. So one of the ways of persuading them that maybe Zionism wasn't such a bad idea after all was for the anti-Semites to become a little more active in their hostility. And in that way, they would encourage Jews that the Zionist path was the right one. And Herzl went on to say, the poorest will go first to cultivate the soil. So Herzl clearly understood where the land lay. And he goes on, page 29, he says, the emigrants will be led by the mediocre intellects which we produce so superabundantly. So he didn't have a great fondness for the Jewish people. Herzl himself had originally posited the idea that Jews could convert en masse to Catholicism, but that it occurred to him probably wasn't such a good idea. And on page 29, he says, should the powers, that is the great powers, the imperialist powers, declare themselves willing to admit our sovereignty, over a neutral piece of land, then the society, this is the Jewish society, the Zionist society, which is created in order to facilitate the implementation of the Zionist project, will enter into negotiations for the possession of this land. Here, two territories come under consideration, comma, Palestine and Argentina. Herzl was not religious in the slightest. He had no particular fondness for Palestine, and so he saw Argentina with its vast lands as being equally suitable. In the end, of course, because the power of religion to legitimize a movement as such, coupled with the strategic importance of Palestine itself, resolved the issue. But for Herzl, he didn't particularly mind. It could be any territory. And in fact, in the final Zionist Congress, the Sixth Zionist Congress in 1903, after which Herzl died very shortly, the Congress was convulsed by the Uganda project because Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary, had offered Uganda, in fact, it's the Kenyan Highlands today, but it was called the Uganda project, as a place where the Jews could colonize and settle, but the white settlers objected to this, and in the end, it fell through. And this caused massive, dislocation in the Zionist Congress. The Russian Zionists walked out, and although the project was passed, it was passed by a small majority, and it became very clear that there would be no Zionist movement anymore if the Ugandan project continued. In fact, in 1905, a group from the Zionist movement broke off, the territorialists, under someone called Israel Zangwill, because they were devoted to finding any territory, and it didn't have to be Palestine. But I am slightly detracting from the topic of this talk, so I won't continue anymore. On page 29 again of this book, it was a founding pamphlet. Is it so incredibly important? He said, immigration is consequently futile unless based on an assured supremacy. That's immigration to Palestine. So in Herzl's view, you first had to reach an agreement before you started colonizing. In fact, it didn't happen like that. Colonization started even though there was no agreement with the Ottoman Sultan and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire tolerated the Zionist settlers, and they were protected by the imperialist powers as well. So they built up gradually different colonies, starting with, I think it was Petah Tikva in around 1878, Rishon LeZion, and various other colonies. Many of them supported by Baron Edmund Rothschild. But on page 30, under, and you can see that if you can read Palestine or Argentina. So it was quite clear to Herzl. He wasn't particularly concerned as to the location of the Zionist project. He said, supposing His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. This was his belief or dream. And then this is the most important part. We should there form a portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So already Herzl was saying the role that Israel would eventually take. It would be an outpost of civilization, an outpost of Western imperialism. And that is exactly what Israel is today. Israel doesn't, maybe geographically located in the Middle East, but it sees itself as part of Europe and the West. You know that Israel, is, for instance, enters into the Eurovision Song Contest and so on. So culturally, Israel sees itself as very much the outpost of imperialism. And that, as I say, pertains to today. Zionism was also, as I said, a movement of late colonialism. And colonialism, as it developed towards the end of the 19th century, became imbued with all sorts of racist ideas, social Darwinism, the idea of the survival of the fittest, that there was a biological scientific reason why Europeans were colonizing Africa. It was because they were inherently superior. The so-called science of eugenics arrived at this time as well. The idea that white people were inherently superior and had to remain that way, and therefore you had to breed out those who weren't racially superior. And this was exemplified in a number of different figures. The first one was Max Norder. Max Norder was Herzl's deputy. He was a physician, and he wrote a book called Degeneration. I quote, he said, "Degenerates are not always criminals, prostitutes, anarchists, and pronounced lunatics. They are often authors and artists." In other words, he believed in the concept of a degenerate art, modern art, impressionism, and so on. To him, this was degenerate and a sign of the degeneration of a race, of a people. And if you've ever read Mein Kampf or aware of what Hitler said, then you'll know that Hitler too and Goebbels were also very much concerned with degeneracy in the arts and in culture. And in fact, the Nazis held exhibitions of degenerate art to show the German people just how degenerate the Weimar Republic had been with its sexual liberation of sorts and so on. It's quite ironic, actually, that the crowds flocked to these exhibitions of degenerate art because they actually quite liked it. And in fact, they were closed down as a result. And Norder said in an interview with La Libre Parole, said Edward Drummond was the leader of the anti-Dreyfus Swords, the representative of those who wanted the Jews to be expelled from France or to be confined back into the ghetto and so on. But he was on very good terms with the Zionists. He welcomed Zionism. In an interview, Norder explained that Zionism, quote, is not a question of religion, but exclusively of race. And he goes on to say, there is no one with whom I am in greater agreement on this position than Mr. Drummond, M. Drummond. And that was absolutely right. Drummond and the reactionaries, the racists, the anti-Semites, they saw the Jewish people in a different light from the traditional Christian or feudal anti-Semites. As I think I said previously in my last talk, for a Christian anti-Semite, once a Jew converted, that was the end of it. Once they entered the baptismal fount, they were no longer a Jew. But for Drummond and for Houston Stuart Chamberlain and all the theorists of racial supremacy and race in Germany, France, and elsewhere, once a Jew, always a Jew. Even if they converted, they were still Jewish. So Marx, whose parents had converted to Christianity, was always referred to as the Jew Marx by Hitler and others. And as I say, Zionism, because it saw the great advantage in anti-Semitism, rather came to understand it. I mean, let us understand that all the great allies, in the sense of Zionism, have been anti-Semitic. I mean, for example, the great benefactor, the headquarters of the Zionist Federation is named after him in Britain, was Arthur Balfour, who was known as Bloody Balfour because he was chief secretary in Ireland in the 19th century when there was a famous shooting at Mitchelstown in Cork. Balfour was an arch-imperialist. He was an absolute racist. He believed that the black man would never reach the level of the white man, and said so explicitly in Parliament at a time when people were moving away from those ideas. Incidentally, we can't just put it down to the times. But Balfour openly shared anti-Semitic views. He told Weizmann that he'd had a long conversation with Cosima Wagner in Beirut, the widow of Richard Wagner, and he agreed with many of her ideas. And Weizmann said, yes, yes, we too also have our views on the wickedness of German Jewry as well. Balfour in 1905, as Prime Minister of Britain, introduced the Aliens Act, specifically aimed at keeping Jews out of Britain, the Jewish refugees from Tsarist Russia, of whom about 100 to 150,000 immigrated between about 1850 and 1914. Balfour was opposed to their immigration, and a movement grew up around that, the British Brothers League, which was a proto-fascist organization. And really, it led to the creation in the 1930s of the British Union of Fascists under Sir Oswald Mosley, an explicitly anti-Semitic organization, actually adopted the name of National Socialism in the end. And it's interesting because Chaim Weizmann, I should explain, was a long-time president of the World Zionist Organization. He was a major figure in negotiating the Balfour Declaration, in easing the path diplomatically, and in the end, he became the first president of the State of Israel. So he's a key figure. He was always at loggerheads tactically with Ben-Gurion, who was more pro-American and saw much earlier than Weizmann that British imperialism would have to be ditched. But nonetheless, he was an absolutely major figure, and he wrote an autobiography, which I have, but I won't show it you now, called Trial and Error.
Tony, 30 minutes.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Let me know when it's 45 or if I get to that. And he said the founder of the British Brothers League was an MP, the MP for Stepney, William Evans Gordon, who became notorious in the Jewish community. And the British Brothers League, say, I mean, it was composed of all sorts of elements, including working class EastEnders. And Weizmann said of Sir William Evans Gordon, that our people, and you can find this, I think it's on page 8990 of Trial and Error. He said, let me have a look. I have actually got notes, which, yes, no, page 1991. He said, our people were rather hard on him. This is Evans Gordon, the primary anti-Semite in Parliament. The Aliens Bill in England and the movement which grew around it were natural phenomena. In other words, were inevitable. You couldn't stop them, which might have been foreseen. Sir William Evans Gordon had no particular anti-Jewish prejudices. He acted as he thought, according to his best lights, and in the most kindly way in the interest of his country. He was sincerely ready to encourage any settlement of Jews almost anywhere in the British Empire. But he failed to see why the ghettos of London or Leeds or Whitechapel should be made into a branch of the ghettos of Warsaw and Pinsk. I mean, Warsaw and Pinsk, or Warsaw in particular, was the largest concentration of Jews in Europe. And we know the tragedy of the Warsaw Ghetto when it was eliminated by the Nazis in 1942 and 43. Something like 500,000 Jews, the vast majority of whom were exterminated. So that was Weizmann's attitude to William Evans Gordon, who was the Enoch Powell of his time. He was a hate figure for any Jew, as were the British Brothers League, which was responsible for violence against the Jews and attacks on them and so on. So it was organized on almost paramilitary lines and was the precursor of the British Union of Fascists and all that came with them. And he went on to say, because he was a scientist, he was a chemist. So he used analogies from chemistry. And he said, whenever the quantity of Jews in any country reaches saturation point, those of you who remember your chemistry remember that there's a certain saturation point for anything which dissolves, any solvent in water, for example, salts in water and so on. Whenever the quantity of Jews in any country reaches saturation point, that country reacts against them. In the early years of this century, Whitechapel and the great industrial centres of England were in that sense saturated. They couldn't take any more. And he goes on to say, and there's an ellipsis, so I've missed out something, the determining factor in this matter is not the solubility of the Jews, but the solvent power of the country. So in other words, it doesn't matter what the Jews do. The fact is, there is a certain level beyond which the country simply cannot take them. England had reached a point where she could or would absorb so many Jews and no more. This, in essence, was what you today call the numbers game, that, yes, Britain can absorb so many, but we can't absorb any more black people or Asian people or whoever. I mean, this is a racist nonsense, of course, and socialists should be the first to understand that. But that was the Zionist understanding, that the Jews actually caused anti-Semitism because they exceeded the saturation point, the tolerance level of the non-Jews. And this is how whenever anyone tells you about the socialist origins of Zionism, you should bear this in mind. And some, like Jacob Klatskin, who was the editor of the Zionist paper Die Welt and a co-author of the Encyclopedia Judaica, was even more explicit. He said, and his essays can be found in a book, was it Arthur Hertzberg, the Zionist Idea, for those of you who are interested. Incidentally, I intend to produce, I've got notes, and I'm going to try and compile all of them into one publication, which I will distribute. So you can write to me, or you can follow my blog, or contact me at my email address. And at the end of the talks, I hope I can produce something which you can take away and keep and refer to. Klatskin was quite clear. He said, we ought to be thankful to our oppressors that they closed the gates of assimilation to us and took care that our people were concentrated and not dispersed. I mean, this is the anti-Semites, the people who were attacking Jews, who were waging pogroms against them and so on. We should be grateful and thankful to them. And he went on to say he had other words for the diaspora, what I said is the galut. And he described Jews in exile as the Zionists considered them. He said the Jews were a people disfigured in both body and soul, in a word of a horror, some sort of outlandish creature, in any case, not a pure national type, some sort of oddity among the peoples going by the name of Jews. And this was quite common. This was quite common. You know, I mean, today, if you say one word out of place, then you are accused of being an anti-Semite. Zionists are very, very concerned about any inflection of the voice. You remember Jeremy Corbyn, he pronounced Epstein, and immediately David Baddiel jumps on him and says, this is anti-Semitic. But if you knew some of the things that Zionists were saying then about Jews, you would understand what hypocritical rubbish this is. For instance, Pinchas Rosen, who was the first Israeli Minister of Justice in 1949, the first Ben-Gurion government, who was actually a very liberal Zionist in many ways. He described Palestine as, and I quote, an institute for the fumigation of Jewish vermin. Imagine anyone calls Jews vermin today, you would say they were an out-and-out anti-Semites. And Yosef Sprinzak, the first speaker of the Knesset, spoke of the new German immigrants as a great deal of filth in the Yishuv. The Yishuv is a Jewish community. They had utter contempt for them. And there's a very, I'm taking much of this. There's a very good article called Classic Zionism in the Journal of Israeli History. I think it's volume 8, but again, I will give you the notes and the reference. Joachim Doron, an academic, he described how rather than take up arms against the enemies of the Jews, Zionism attacked the, quote, enemy within, the diaspora Jew himself, and subjected him to a hail of criticism. And he goes on to say, indeed, a perusal of Zionist sources reveals criticism, quote, so scathing that the generation that witnessed Auschwitz has difficulty comprehending them. In other words, so vile and so hostile were the Zionist descriptions of Jewish people in the diaspora that today, in the light of Auschwitz and the Holocaust, most Jews simply would not understand how these things could be said, with the result that most of these Zionist sources you can only find in academic books such as I have come across. And one of the main culprits in this was Arthur Rupin. I think I mentioned him last week. Arthur Rupin is really the second major figure in the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Israel, or pre-state Israel. He was director of the Palestine office from 1908, and he controlled the nuts and bolts of colonization. He was really the original supporter and founder of the kibbutzim. And he said of the Jews from the Orient, the Sephardic Jews, they were not suitable since they carried Semitic dysgenic elements. He was of the view that Jews in Europe were basically of Indo-German origin, in other words, Aryans. And he brought in Yemenite Jews into Palestine to do the hard work. And nearly half of them died between 1912 and 1918. They were paid starvation wages and they were denied medical attention. And Etan Bloom, who's written a PhD thesis on Arthur Rupin, it's available on the internet, and anyone interested should get it. He talks of the pathological stereotyping by Arthur Rupin, who was an out-and-out racist of the Yemenite Jews. Indeed, when a friend of Rupin called him an anti-Semite, he didn't deny it. He retorted, "I have already established here in his diary that I despise the cancers of Judaism more than does the worst anti-Semite." And I should quote maybe here an Israeli historian, Yigal Ilan, who was a member of the Israeli Labour Party, in his book Introduction to Zionism, Zionist History, but he said, and this is worth thinking about because it sums it up, that Zionism, and you can find it in incidentally in an essay by Moshe Machava and Mary Offenberg in Chamsin 6. It's a small pamphlet that Max Penn used to issue, and there was a number of editions. This is number 6, Zionism and its Scarecrows. And he quotes, Moshe quotes, "Zionism did not consider anti-Semitism an abnormal, absurd, perverse, or marginal phenomena. Zionism considered anti-Semitism a fact of nature, a standard constant, the norm in the relationship of the non-Jews to the presence of the Jews in their midst, a normal, almost rational reaction of the Gentiles and non-Jews to the abnormal, absurd, and perverse situation of the Jewish people in the diaspora." In other words, I mean, one of the goals of Zionism was the winding up of the diaspora, and this has not changed. If you remember the reaction of Benjamin Netanyahu to the attacks in France, the killing of 4 Jews in the Hypercacher supermarket. He came to France, and what did he say? He didn't say fight anti-Semitism, stand up for your rights. He said, come to Israel. Israel is your natural home. And the Jewish congregation in Paris where he spoke erupted immediately after that with the Marseille. So, I mean, the French Jews made it quite clear where they stood. And this was exactly the same reaction to the massacre of 11 Jews in the Pittsburgh synagogue. Avi Gabbay, the right-wing leader of the Israeli Labour Party, his message to them was, come home. In other words, do exactly what the anti-Semites want you to do and leave America. And this, of course, has been the programme of the Zionists. And this really has not changed today, although it takes different forms. So if we look around the world, who are the friends of Zionism?
45 minutes, Tony.
All right, I'm almost finished now. Duterte of Philippines, who's expressed his open admiration for Hitler. Bolsonaro in Brazil, another Hitler admirer. Again, I mean, both of them pay their tributes to the Holocaust dead in Israel's propaganda museum called Yad Vashem. And we can look around at fascist groups. Almost all fascist groups today love Israel, but still hate Jews. Tommy Robinson, He's a proud Zionist. Donald Trump, he never tired of telling American Jews they were disloyal and that Israel was their real home, but he was an absolute ardent Zionist. So I think we can take away from this the message that really Zionism and anti-Semitism are really twins of a kind, two sides of the same coin. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've gone on so long, but it is actually quite a long topic. I'll be more than happy to deal with people's questions, and I'll have a quick look in the chat.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Just remind comrades to use the raise hand function if you would like to ask a question or make a comment. There's quite a lot of material there. I'm sure also Tony will put some of his material on the LLA education site. So again, that should be quite easily available to people. Okay, I'll just see there's one hand raised. Dave Turner, would you like to come in, Dave?
Sorry, I'm just checking you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Dave. Yeah, go ahead.
Tony, thank you once again for a fantastic sort of not just executive summary, but the detailed nature of the way the cross-referencing. One document which is extremely controversial but still comes up today, you didn't refer to today. I'm not saying you should have done, but in terms of the Tsarist nature, the Black Hundreds, and the other elements of your sort of historiography, where does the notorious forgery, such as the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, fit into these sorts of discussions? Obviously, I'm not a supporter of that document at all, but it is something that's been around an awful long time, since at least the late 19th century. Where does that fit into this sort of discussion in terms of the way in which you very eloquently positioned the views of Zionists as opposed to anti-Semites, and the way there was almost a synergy in what you've been talking about? Thank you. Okay,
thanks, Dave. A question in the question and answer box, Tony.
Yeah.
It says, is there a central authority for Judaism in the United Kingdom? And I think, who defines Jewishness? I think this is probably an idea of both in the religious and cultural sense. For example, are the Board of Deputies the equivalent of the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope or whatever? It's sorry, it's a bad analogy, but I hope you take my meaning. Okay. Are there any other comrades put their hands up? I'm just trying to look. Any further questions at all?
Yes, Matthew Jones.
Okay, in you come, Matthew.
Hi, comrades. You can see I've fixed my camera from last night. A quick purchase. Anyway, a couple of things, I think. Really good talk by Tony, but I think what will be interesting is actually the effect of all this in terms of, the British Labour movement, which I know has had a number of flip-flops and splits on this question, from the Aliens Act of 1905, which split the Labour Party, down to the present. And I think, as Tony has pointed out, that of course, and as I remember, obviously that actually, of course, the left of the Labour Party was traditionally Zionist, right through from the war, Second World War onwards. With all the nonsense about kibbutzim and so on and so forth, and you get whole chunks of people who go over to Israel, who would say that they were socialists. And then, of course, as you say, it's in the 80s, it obviously I think both with the impact of various of Israel's worst wars, plus of course the change of the left, the fact that the left itself changed its composition. You had a new influx of the left in the 80s. It changes over, and then of course it becomes the right wing, or the most ardent Zionists, and the left all obviously supports the Palestinian cause, which is what they should have done in the first place. But it's interesting to see what further information Tony can produce on that. I'm sure he's got a whole fund of it.
Okay, thanks. Pam Blakelock. Pam?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Pam, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Right, yeah. Okay. I was brought up in a Zionist family, and in my adolescence, I joined the Zionist youth movement, which I think was maybe allied to the Labour Party. It was called Habonim, which means the builders. And of course, we were lied to that Israel, because of the kibbutz and the communal nature of socialism, etc. Israel was a socialist country, and that's where my ideas of socialism came from, because my parents were conservative. And okay. Oh, by the way, Margaret Hodge was also a member of Habonim, but I didn't know her because she must have been younger than me. Okay. Yeah. So, well, it was very inspiring, and it wasn't until my later adolescence that the scales fell from my eyes, and I began to see what Israel really was. It was nothing to do with socialism. It was totally a capitalist country. But Tony was talking about this labor wave, and how, in my opinion, the Israeli government under Ben-Gurion, I think, cynically used the idealism of young Jews, and I assume ideas from Russia and the Bund and Marxism. So yeah, I'd like to know a bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pam. I've got a question that's really related to that, Tony, and it's really about the development of a sort of specifically socialist Zionism. I'm sure that's going to be something you're going to look at later on, but it struck me that you talk about Zionism being a reaction to anti-Semitism, and it might also be that for certain people, the development of a sort of labor Zionism, socialist Zionism, might be an antidote, say, to communism, and particularly the specifically socialist movements like the Bund and the others, or even non-socialist movements for that matter, that saw the Jewish population's home being in Europe, and that emancipation would come within Europe, not through emigration. So I'd be interested if you could talk a little about the origins of that. And then a sort of another matter, and it comes really from Herzl and the others that you were talking about, and this is the sort of scientific racism, and indeed the almost non-religious character. And I'm interested because that idea that the Jews are a separate race, and a race as opposed to a religion, and indeed a distinct culture, although the two things would reinforce each other, does seem to sort of sit at variance with the way that Zionism is portrayed today. And I understand why that might be so, but I'm quite interested in that parallelism. And I wondered when you think that started to fade. Did scientific racism fade, for example, with the emergence of the Nazis, or indeed in the post-45 period? Again, I'm sure that's something you're going to look at later on, but it struck me that it might be relevant in discussion about Herzl. Yeah. Okay. Any further comrades for this round who want to ask a question? Okay, Tony, if you could come back in.
Right. Okay. I'm just trying to. Right. Okay, there was actually one question which I did pick up in the chat. What was the party of Sir William Evans Gordon? He was a Conservative MP for Stepney. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I'm not an expert on them. The best book is by Norman Cohen, COHN, Warrant for Genocide. And of them, it was said, yes, it was Warrant for Genocide by Norman Cohen. From recollection, the Protocols of Elders of Zion underwent a considerable transformation. There were actually a progressive pamphlet issued against Napoleon III. That was their origins, but they, say, were transformed and underwent much development and ended up, in essence, as a Tsarist forgery. And they were really the center of the world Jewish conspiracy theory, that there were these elders of Zion who were manipulating history and the non-Jewish nations in order to achieve Jewish supremacy throughout the world. And they received massive publicity. They went through countless editions. And at one time, the Times in Britain gave
We have a message. Beep, beep.
So, yes, they're extremely important. And Hitler refers to them in Mein Kampf. And he says the fact that the Frankfurter Zeitung, a paper in Germany, attacks them is in itself proof of their truth. So, I mean, the anti-Semites swore by the protocols, and they were indeed the basis, the ideological basis, and they formed it, of anti-Semitism. You will have to correct me if I miss out some questions, if I've forgotten them, by the way. My notes are not brilliant. Is there a central authority for Jews in Britain? Well, the Board of Deputies of British Jews claims that, but it represents maybe 30% the synagogue-going Jews, but not the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox Jews who have a separate Union of Hebrew congregations. And it's quite interesting during the whole Corbyn affair that the rabbis of the Union of Hebrew Congregation put out a statement dissociating themselves from the attack on Corbyn by the Board of Deputies. But of course, it's got no publicity, except the Jewish Chronicle, which tried to discredit them. But certainly the board only represents a minority. They don't represent secular Jews, for example, people like myself. So, but the Board of Deputies derives its authority in many ways. It was originally set up in the reign of George III as a supplicant organization. It's always been an organization of the kind of petty bourgeois Jews. The bigger capitalists have never historically associated themselves with it, except in its very early days. Pam talks about how Zionism was portrayed, Israel was portrayed as a socialist state, and she was a member of Habonim Dror. I have to say, I wasn't a member of that. I was a member of a far more right-wing religious Zionist youth group, B'nai Akiva, which Pam may know, and B'nai Akiva, which was part of the National Religious Party, if you like, metamorphosed into the Greater Israel movement after 1967. So I was a member of probably the most reactionary group, but at that time I didn't understand or realize that, and I suspect quite a number of people in it also didn't. But it was a change historically in Israel for the first 30 years, the religious Zionists in the National Religious Party formed part of the coalition government with the Israeli Labour Party. But today, they are the supporters of Netanyahu. And in fact, the far right derives from the religious Zionism, the Messianism and so on, the desire for racial purity, because
you know, I mean, there's always been an injunction in the Jewish religion against marrying out, marrying someone who's non-Jewish. It's not dissimilar to the attitude of Catholics historically to marrying Protestants and so on. But when the rabbis take over a state, when the religious leaders take over a state, that no longer becomes an aspect, if you like, of religious chauvinism. That becomes racism. And the religion legitimizes the racism, and it becomes the worst form. The worst anti-Semitism in Europe was not in Nazi Germany even. It was in the Christian nationalist states like Romania, Hungary, Croatia. Croatia, the only state to set up an extermination camp that was which was not under the control of the Nazis, Jasenovac, mainly used for Serbs, but also many Jews perished there as well. And Slovakia, which was headed by a Catholic priest, Father Tiso, which caused consternation, to say the least, in the Vatican. So that is, if you like, my history. But yes, when I was brought up, I was told, well, if you're a socialist, go to Israel. It's the only socialist state in the world. And of course, the Labour left looked towards Israel as a kind of model. They never told you the kibbutzim were only Jewish, that an Arab could not become a member. And of course, they didn't tell you the kibbutzim were established on the confiscated Arab villages, the raised Arab villages of the indigenous population which had been expelled. There were all sorts of things that you were told. However, I will, my next talk is on socialist Zionism. So you'll forgive me if I don't spend too much time on that, because we are going to cover that topic. Kevin, and likewise the origins of socialist Zionism. In essence, I mean, very briefly, I mean, Zionism was seen in Russia. I mean, it certainly attracted support. I mean, because when a people are under attack, I mean, messianism grows, the illusions that there is a new Jerusalem somewhere else where you can go. And Zionism caught that mood without a doubt. But as Jews fought back, they saw that Zionism was their enemy. I mean, the Zionist movement was illegal in Tsarist Russia. Herzl had traveled specifically to see von Plehve and the Tsarist ministers, Count Witte and so on, to secure that legalization. And the Tsarist ministers understood very well that Zionism was the counterpole of attraction to Jews, that it attracted Jews away from the revolutionary movement, which is why it was tolerated and supported in Russia. And it was in those circumstances that socialist Zionism was created as a means of reconciling the contradiction between socialism, which means you fight where you are, and Zionism, which means you don't fight where you are, but you escape to somewhere else. So that is really the origins. And historically, the socialist or left Zionist movements outside Palestine were always to the left of Palestinian Zionism, which was, if you like, imbued with a colonialist idea. They had to defend their settlements against the indigenous people they'd thrown out of them and so on. So Palestinian Zionism was always a right-wing variant, but it was clearly, being in Palestine, it was a dominant variant. The ideas of a separate race, well, Zionism absorbed the ideas that were current at the time. The ideas that the white man was superior because biological inheritance, survival of the fittest. I mean, these ideas of race, I mean, you know, I mean, they were applicable also to class in a way. I mean, Hitler described the working class as inferior racially, and the capitalists were the top of the, if you like, the Aryan ladder. I mean, I listened to a lecture by Ken Malik recently, and this was true also of the British working class. They were seen as racially inferior. And in fact, the workers of Southampton who were demonstrating, I think it was 1885, I don't know if people remember are aware of what was called the Governor Eyre incident in Jamaica, a particularly reactionary governor, after the rising amongst the black people in Jamaica, went on the rampage and hanged 1,000 black people, including one of their leaders, quite illegally. And I think he was recalled, and committees were set up to support or oppose Governor Eyre. Incidentally, one of the supporters of Governor Eyre was Charles Dickens, so I don't believe that Dickens was any kind of revolutionary. He certainly wasn't. But in Southampton, there was a mass demonstration of workers against Governor Eyre, and they were referred to, I can't remember where, but I can go back to the sources. They were referred to as Negroes. They were seen as the equivalent of black people, also racially degenerate. So, I mean, the working class has always also been seen in racial terms, and that was true yesterday, and it still is in a sense as well. I mean, that's how the Nazis justified their attitude and destruction of the organizations of the working class. But Zionism absorbed all of this, and I spoke of Arthur Rupin. I mean, he was a believer in the racial sciences. He was also called the father of sociology in Palestine, Jewish sociology in Palestine. He believed fervently in them. 80% of Jewish applicants to emigrate to Palestine were rejected because they weren't of suitable quality, for example. And this idea that Palestine was going to become the home for all Jews, regardless of who they were, simply not true. They rejected Jews who were old, who weren't self-sufficient, who didn't have anything to contribute, and so on. They aimed to get as high a quality immigrant as was possible. And Rupin was in the prime position to do that because he was a director of the Palestine office. He channeled the funds. He said what they could go on, and so on. And there was no greater friend of the Labour Zionists than Arthur Rupin. I mean, I say, you don't hear much about him because, I mean, some of what he did and said was absolutely outrageous and was so indefensible, even the Zionists can't defend it. But he was in the prime pole position. And many streets in Israel are named after Arthur Rupin, including the boulevard which leads up to the Knesset. It's the Arthur Rupin Boulevard. So he was, but he wasn't alone in the believer in the racial sciences, because Zionism has always believed its justification as the Jews are a superior race. And I think it was Zangwill who coined the term that Palestine was a country for a people. It was a land for a people without a home, a land for a people and the people without a home. So, I mean, the Palestinians were always, from the very beginning, absent, missing. Terra nullis, as they said in Australia, the empty land. For the Zionists, say Palestine was a land without a people, for a people without a land. And yeah, I think that's it. Have I covered everything? Is there anyone who's unhappy? Did I miss anything out?
No, I think you've covered that, Tony. Take a rest for a second. I've got two comrades who want to come in.
Right, okay.
Okay, Mike Kennard.
Yeah, it's just a brief historical question, Tony. Anti-Semitism has been rife for many centuries. I mean, you go back to the pogrom in York in the 12th century, and that's been repeated in various countries throughout time. Has any sort of echo of Zionism, I mean, has any element of Zionism historically been present as a result of those pogroms and the anti-Semitism and discrimination that has existed?
Thanks, Mike. Steve Freeman.
Hi, Tony. Great talk as always. This is possibly outside the scope of what you're dealing with today, but I was wondering about how you think about a distinction between Zionism and Israeli nationalism, because although Zionism created Israeli nationalism, you could argue that Israeli nationalism is different from Zionism. In other words, that the idea that the Jews are a nation is different from the idea that Israel has become a nation. So I just wanted to ask you about that. Israeli nationalism and Zionism are connected clearly, but are they quite the same? That's it.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Faraz Khan.
Can you, I was just, I put it in my chat. I I'm not familiar with the Jewish religion prayer-wise. What does the prayer next year in Jerusalem mean, and is it relevant to modern-day Zionism?
Thanks, Faraz. Any other comrades at all? I don't see anybody in the chat box there. Yeah, one just. I think there's just one come in. Sorry. Ian Chalmers, please. Could you come in, Ian? If you could unmute. Thanks. Thanks, Ian.
You want me to speak now? Is that
Yes,
right?
please. Yeah. Ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. It was, as usual, a very remarkable evidence-based, detailed evidence-based presentation. Thank you. I wondered if you had anything to say about the Christian Zionist precedents of Zionism. Oliver Cromwell was a Christian Zionist, motivated mainly by the Old Testament in the Bible, with a view from that it was the destiny of the Jewish people to, in inverted commas, return to the Holy Land, and got quite a lot of support from very influential people like Lord Shaftesbury, a person who got rid of led the movement to abolish slavery. So on those grounds, a good guy, but who basically seems to me, with others, to have laid the ground during the 19th century among Christians that political Zionism would be a perfectly natural development based on the Old Testament scriptures. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, comrades. I'm going to just make a last call now for questions and comments. There's still plenty of time to talk, but I'm just going to make that last call, and then I'll ask Tony to come back in and answer those particular questions, and then we'll see if we get any more in. Okay, Tony.
Okay, there's quite a lot there, and I probably could go on for some time about them. The first question was about anti-Semitism existing for many centuries, and the example of York, where hundreds of Jews, I think, were burnt at the stake, and it was a terrible massacre, and so on. It was a peasant massacre. I quoted in my first talk, and I'll look for it again. It is quite useful if I can find it. Yes, Abraham Leon. He wrote The Jewish Question, a Marxist Interpretation. And for anyone who seriously wants to understand the Jewish question, they should read that book. It's a couple of 100 pages, but the analysis is quite brilliant. And he wrote in it that Zionism transposes modern anti-Semitism to all of history and saves itself the trouble of studying the various forms of anti-Semitism and their evolution. And I think that's critical, really, to understanding anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has changed, it has evolved. The original what was the role of Jews in Europe? They were primarily traders, merchants, moneylenders, tax farmers, the agents of money in a society that was largely based on use values. And they were employed by the nobles to collect the tax revenues.
And of course, they would pass them on and keep some for themselves. So they were seen by the peasants as their oppressors. And in York, for example, what it was, in its own savage way, was a peasant rebellion against those they saw as their immediate overlords. And the first thing they did was to get hold of the documents which testified to how much they owed. Not that it availed them any, because the king at the time ensured that they would pay regardless. So that anti-Semitism was an economic reaction against what Leon called a people class. It was economic in origin. And that was true of the mass wave of the massacres, much larger ones in Europe, the Chmielniki massacres carried out by the Cossacks. Again, a peasant rebellion. And they were very, very savage. The nature of peasant rebellions were not very pretty, to say the least. And the Chmielniki rebellion massacred far more than just Jews, and equally barbaric. But that was the way at the time. Modern anti-Semitism owes nothing to that. You could argue, and I have argued, I think that when Kevin was doing a seminar, that anti-Semitism, the memory of anti-Semitism, the feudal memory of anti-Semitism, was employed as a political weapon by the Nazis. I have to say, without going too much into that, I mean, people, when they think of Nazis, they think of anti-Semites and anti-Semitism. But in fact, the Nazis played down anti-Semitism. They barely mentioned it between 1930 and 33 when they wanted to get into power. They stood as the opponents of Marxism, of Bolshevism, not as anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism was not respectable in Weimar Germany. Anti-Semitism was declining. It was not increasing. And so, of course, the rewrite of history by Zionism says that what Hitler represented and the Nazis was a war against the Jews in the title of the book by Lucy Davidovitz, one of the most influential Zionist historians. Nothing about the working class, nothing about the organizations of the working class, and so on. Their analysis of the Nazis begins and ends with the Jews. And of course, that's very convenient because it lets the ruling classes of Europe off the hook in terms of their own support for Hitler. For example, at the time of the Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany, which the Zionists opposed and the Jewish bourgeoisie opposed, and of course the non-Jewish bourgeoisie opposed. I mean, the Roosevelt administration, I can't remember which spokesperson, in arguing against the boycott, referred to Hitler as the moderating element in the Nazi government, whereas we all know today that in fact Hitler was the most radical element in terms of the Holocaust and so on. So when you say anti-Semitism has persisted for many centuries, I disagree. The idea that somehow there was this eternal, they call it the longest hatred now, that's not true. That's simply not true. Jews were oppressors as well as the oppressed. Certainly they were victims of Christian anti-Semitism, the Crusaders, as they set out, massacred the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, for example, and thousands died. I'm not saying they had an easy time in many stages of history, but to simply write the Jews off Jewish history in exile, as it were, as one long history of persecution, it simply transforms them into ahistorical figures, cardboard cutouts in a sense, because you really do have to ask the question in that case, and of course Zionism can't answer it, as to why the Jews were the eternal victims, or in the words of the anti-Semites, the eternal Jews. As for echoes of Zionism, yes, whenever the Jews were oppressed, whenever their situation deteriorated, as it did with the advent of capitalism, early capitalism in Britain and Western Europe, which incidentally resulted, as we know, in England in about the 12th century in the expulsion of the Jews under Edward I, and similarly the expulsion of the Jews from France and elsewhere, and they were expelled into Eastern Europe, where capitalism wasn't developing, where it was strictly feudal, and they were welcomed into places like Poland. When the Jews were expelled from Spain, they went to Poland and they went to North Africa, for example.
And in a sense, in Western Europe, those Jews that remained did so undercover until Cromwell readmitted them officially. In fact, most of them had been there all the time. And the person who asked the question, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, the early Zionists were not Jewish, they were Christians. Cromwell certainly, but not just Cromwell. You can go through the figures of British imperialism, Lord Palmerston, Shaftesbury, the novelist George Eliot and Daniel Deronda, the secretary to Napoleon III, Ernest Halaharan, Napoleon Bonaparte, who wanted to see a Jewish state. The Christians wanted to see a Jewish state, and they rationalized it in terms of their biblical interpretation because it fitted in, as it does today, with their imperialist ambitions. I mean, that was what it was about. Of course, the Jews at certain times fell for a form of messianism. Whenever their situation was such, they despaired of life as it was, then yes, they looked towards God and a solution that would spirit them to the promised land. For instance, in the 16th century, Shabtai Tzvi arose, a figure who promised to lead them back to that promised land, and he had a mass following. But the Ottoman Emperor gave him a choice: abandon the idea of that he was the Messiah and was going to lead the Jews to a new and promised land, or he would have him executed. So Shabtai Tzvi decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and he abandoned his followers. So, I mean, those movements arose. Hasidim, a current within Jewry, also arose because of the despair of Jewry. But there was no serious project until colonialism for the emigration of Jews to Palestine. We have to understand, Zionism was a product of colonialism. It wasn't a movement that existed, as the Zionists would say, for 2,000 years. And when, yes, they say next year in Jerusalem, and as Bernard Lazare, in his book about the causes of anti-Semitism, explained, this was nothing more than the expression of the desire that next year we will be free, we will not be oppressed, and so on. It wasn't a political project. For 400 years under the Ottoman Empire, any Jew who wanted could go to Palestine, and many Orthodox Jews did, to study and to die, and they were kept alive by charity, chalukah, from Jews outside Palestine. But there was no desire on their part to achieve Jewish sovereignty. On the contrary, they were opposed to the Zionists, who they saw as irreligious nationalists, many of whom were atheists, who came at the beginning of the 20th century. I had a question from Steve Freeman on Israeli nationalism. And in a sense, it's a topic in itself, Steve. The mythology of Zionism is that there is one Jewish nation, one Jewish people. And the Zionists have opposed vehemently the idea that Israel forms a nation or a people by itself and separate from the Jewish people. And there have been two cases. I can't remember the first one, but the second one was Uzi Ornan versus the State of Israel in about 2013. And the Supreme Court in Israel has been quite clear that there is no Israeli nationality, and that to accept an Israeli nationality, to accept that there's an Israeli people, would contradict all the essence, all the fundamentals of Zionism itself. It would set up the Israeli people against the Jewish people. Now, you could argue that that is exactly what is happening. There is a growing disenchantment amongst major sections of the Jewish community, in particular in America. I mean, one of the fastest growing organizations is that wonderful organization, Jewish Voice for Peace. And if you are Jewish, or if you're not Jewish, I recommend you to join it because it came out last year as an anti-Zionist organization and has over 100,000 signatories, which is quite significant in its own way. So we are seeing Jews outside Israel, if you like, realizing that their interests do not coincide with those of the Israeli state. That on the contrary, Zionism endangers their position because it posits them as a separate element, a discrete element, not part of the nations amongst whom they reside, because you can't really be a member of two nations simultaneously. And the anti-Semites themselves understand that. They hate anti-Zionist Jews, but they love Israel. They don't see Israel as Jewish, in fact, is reality. So there have been two key cases before the Israeli Supreme Court, because people wanted to register their nationality as Israeli in the population registry, and both times that has been refused. You can be, you have to be registered either by nationality or by religion or both as Jewish. Your nationality is Jewish, and under the Jewish nation state law, you are in the driving seat in Israel. That's why there is no equality between Jews and non-Jews. There are all sorts of, I think, over 100 different nationalities for those who are not Jewish. But there is only one real nationality, and that is the Jewish nation, the myth of the Jewish nation, of course. There was a question, I saw it, it was from Pam, about the second Aliyah, the Labour Zionist wave of emigration, and also was the third Aliyah in the 1920s, the petty bourgeois emigrant. I'm not going to cover that topic now, simply because I will be covering it next week. I don't know whether there's any more questions or whether I failed to answer everything. If so, please come back at me.
There aren't any more questions in the...
There's Pam.
Okay, right, okay. I'll bring Pam in then.
Yeah, all right. It was just a comment about the Christian evangelism, Christian Zionism. What you were saying, Tony, about Arthur Balfour was a supporter of Christian evangelism, if that's the right word, as was Lloyd George, which was very popular at the time and now provide the main base for Trump. And my understanding is they believe that Jews should emigrate to Israel, and when the second coming arrives, they should convert to Christianity, and those who refuse would burn to death. So you see videos of these Christian evangelists visiting Israel, full of these ideas. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to comment on that. Thanks.
Well, you've said most of it yourself. You're absolutely right. I mean, Christian Zionism is, if you like, the religious legitimation. It's of imperialism in the Middle East. I mean, that's what it amounts to. I mean, all the worst anti-Semites who counted were ardently pro-Zionist, and they saw their mission as being blessed by God. I mean, in the words of Bob Dylan, every nation that fights its war has God on its side. And that was equally true of the Christian evangelists. Their mission, which is in the book of Revelations, the idea that the Jews will return to Israel. There will be all sorts of wars between Gog and Magog, I think. There will be the battles of Armageddon, in which large numbers of people will die. And I've seen some of the illustrations that the Christian Zionists provide of these scenarios. 1/3 of the Jews will convert to Christianity and they will ascend with other Christians to heaven. 2/3 of Jews will perish by the sword and will die in the battle and the flames of Armageddon. I mean, the Zionists are quite happy to welcome these Christian Zionists because they don't accept the book of Revelations and the scenarios it paints, but they're quite happy to accept the political support, the money that comes with it, and so on from the Christian Zionists. And the Christians United for Israel, the main pro-Zionist evangelical organization headed by John Hagee, has something like 1.4 million people. I mean, the Christian Zionists are an incredibly important political component, not least of Donald Trump in America. There was a recent BBC program which was quite fascinating. I mean, it's a form in essence of Christian fascism. These are the same people who drove Jews out of Europe and put them to the sword, but seeing the emergence of a Jewish state, something that will fulfill their biblical prophecies. So, I mean, that's how imperialism rationalizes itself, through religion. They are performing God's mission.
And that's been the case, I say, since Oliver Cromwell. I mean, all sorts of Christian imperialist figures, Palmerston, Shaftesbury, and so on. Disraeli was another, supported Zionism. I mean, Shaftesbury, who was, someone said, a liberal reformer, he was particularly concerned, I think, with legislation that protected chimney sweeps, for example. He was opposed to Jewish emancipation in Britain. He held that Britain was a Christian state, and obviously Jews couldn't fulfill those obligations, and therefore they did not deserve civil rights. This idea was very common. Karl Marx is often criticized for anti-Semitism because of his essay on the Jewish question. I have to say, he was, people of course misinterpret it because it was a materialist analysis. He wasn't necessarily terribly, let us say, it wasn't particularly factually well informed because the Jewish population was changing at the very time he wrote it, and he was heavily influenced by Moses Hess. But he was arguing against the idea of Bruno Bohr, or was it Otto Bohr? I can't remember. But anyway, he was arguing, it was a polemical essay that his opponent was arguing that because the Jewish religion was alien to the existing civil society, that Jews should not be emancipated, they should not achieve civil rights. And Marx was saying quite the opposite, and was arguing quite the opposite. And he was saying, despite the Jewish religion not being the most welcoming of religions and having all sorts of features which socialists wouldn't support, nonetheless, the emancipation of Jews was a democratic question. So there's a very good essay actually by Nathan Weinstock in his book Zionism, A False Messiah. It's probably actually the best book on Zionism for people to read, Zionism, A False Messiah. It was produced by the Fourth International. Unfortunately, Nathan Weinstock then emigrated to Israel and became a Zionist. So he did his best to get the book pulped. But if you have a copy, and I do have a copy, then it's a very interesting reading and useful. And it's a very, very good essay on Marx's essay, which I certainly recommend you reading. Have I covered everything? Let me know.
I think so, Tony. I think you've packed a lot into a fairly short time. So we've got no more questions and comments. So I'd like to thank Tony for tonight's talk, and to remind you that next week's talk will go on Friday evening at the same time. Tony can perhaps tell us what he's going to cover in detail just before we go.
Yes, well, I haven't actually drawn up, I haven't yet sat down and decided what the syllabus will be, but it's on socialist Zionism, because if you like, it wasn't the right-wing Zionists, it wasn't the revisionists under Menachem Begin who formed what became the Israeli state and led the Zionist movement for 30 or more years. It was the labor Zionists. It was those who it was claimed were socialists. And I really just want to cover that. It's a big topic, and I have my own views on it, and people may or may not disagree with it. Say, Pam said that she was in Habanim Dror, which was the socialist Zionist equivalent of a youth movement in Britain, whereas I was in the religious Zionist group. But in essence, there was never any difference between socialist Zionism and its right-wing counterparts, as I will explain in part 3 of these talks. So thank you very much for listening and taking part. It's been a great audience and some very searching and penetrating questions. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Tony. Before we go, just want to make a couple of announcements. Please look at the LLA's education pages, both for previous sessions that we've had. We've now been going one way or another for about a year, and we've had a wide range of historical and political topics. So please search those out. We will be starting a new education program on revolution and counter-revolution in the 20th century, particularly looking at the great revolutionary movements, but also looking at the counter-revolutionary movements and particularly obviously Nazism, but also the big debate about the nature of Stalinism in Russia, the nature of the Russian Revolution, and of course imperialism. That series will begin in a few weeks' time, so our normal Thursday slots won't be running, certainly not next week, but there will be 1 or 2 freestanding sessions. Comrades have offered to do particular sessions that don't quite fit into that wider pattern. So if you could look out for those, but there won't be a Thursday session next week. And so I hope comrades will don't mind a Thursday off before we start our new program. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Thank you for your comments and questions, and I look forward to seeing you all next Friday.
Kevin, there's a question in the chat. Could Tony put details of the book he last mentioned?
Yes, it's called Zionism, a False Messiah, and it's by Nathan Weinstock.
Okay.
I think, at least that's my note.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's published, or was published by Inklings. I imagine you can get it on Amazon. I don't know, but it's Weinstock withdrew permission to publish it. He wanted to disown it completely.
Yeah. The other book that Tony mentioned, or he mentioned a few, but the other one, which is of a historical nature by Abram Leon, I think is available on Marxist.org.
I'm sure you're right.
Yeah, and again, that's well worth looking at.
I will put these books up on our website somewhere, comrades. Yeah, Tony, if you could put a list together.
Yeah. What I intend to do is compile all the notes that I've drawn up for these talks, because although I'm looking at you on the screen, I'm in fact looking at my notes as I quote from them. So I hope to put them into a kind of one long PDF file so that people can take them away. But that, obviously, I can only do that at the end of the talks, and I will. There will be book references in them, okay? Because I've taken it from other essays I've done and so on, articles. So I will do that, I promise, and I shall see you all being well next Friday.
Okay.
And now I have 1¼ hours of my curfew left. Before my curfew is imposed, so I'm going to go for a walk.
Okay, have a nice walk, Tony, and see you next Friday.
Yeah, okay, take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.